and it's wonderful to have you all here with us this evening for obviously a very popular and very important and timely debate. As I say, this is an important part of the Cultural Exchanges Festival, which we run on behalf of the university within the Faculty of Humanities, although we are very happy to be here within the Faculty of Business and Law this evening. The event that you are about to enjoy is actually run largely by our third-year students, so very, very, very well represented by Milam and many of the other students here, and we're very pleased for them that there's been such a good response to this event. And I think that we are going to have a very interesting and wonderful debate, and I'm now going to hand you over to Ramiz, who's going to conduct you through the evening. Welcome.
I'd like to start off by saying hello, good evening, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The purpose of today's discussion dialogue is to provide an insight into the two ideologies, Islam and atheism. The aim of today is to achieve and acquire a better understanding of both perspectives. Just a quick profile on our speakers. Dr. Stephen Law is a philosopher and senior researcher, lecturer at the University of London. He is also an editor of the philosophical journal Think, which is published by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Dr. Stephen Law has published academic papers on a variety of topics. His most recent focus is on the philosophy of religion. Dr. Stephen Law has published both a variety of academic papers and more popularly introductory books, including children's philosophy books. Hamza has actually asked me not to do a profile on him. Arguably looks more Pakistani than me, but is actually a Greek convert to Islam, a senior researcher and lecturer for the Islamic Education and Research Academy, IERO. Just to go through a few etiquettes of today, all mobile phones should be switched off, and if they're not switched off, then please you put them on silent. When the speakers are speaking, there should be absolute silence, so everyone should remain quiet and obviously give respect to both the speakers. And to leave all questions for the Q&A session at the end. The structure of today's dialogue will be as follows. Each speaker will have a time limit of 20 minutes for their opening statement, followed by a 10-minute response to the opening statement. Then finally, right at the end, there will be an opportunity for the audience, i.e. yourself, to get involved in the Q&A session. Finally, if any of the speakers goes over their time limit, I will allow them to continue to finish off the next point, and basically what I'll do, I'll extend the time limit so they both get equal time. And I'd like to call Hamzة Andrea Tzortzis, hope I said that right, to give us his opening statement.
I'm going to start as Muslims do in the name of God. In alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Brothers, sisters, and friends, and those who are undecided, I greet you with the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those who don't know what that means, that actually means may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Islam or atheism? We have a question here today, brothers, sisters, and friends. How are we going to answer this? Well, I think the best way to answer this is to use the rational method of thinking. To use our logic, our reasoning, our previous experience, so we apply to the whole cosmos and the universe to come to a conclusion. And I believe if we stick to this method, we're going to come to the conclusion that there are good reasons to believe in the Islamic worldview. This is why the famous professor, Edward Monte, said, Islam is a religion that is essentially rationalistic in the wider sense of the term. And to argue that the belief in Islam is rational and therefore probably the right choice, I would use the following arguments. 1, the belief in Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. 2, the belief in Islam makes sense of the nature of the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims. So let's go straight to the first argument. The belief in Islam makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, we've all asked the same questions. Where did the universe come from? Why does something exist? rather than nothing. This is part of our Western tradition as well. The great German polymath Leibniz, he said, the first question that should be asked and answered is that why does something exist rather than nothing? In this light, the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, also says, or do they think the universe came out of nothing? Now, how do we respond to this question? Well, if we respond like Bertrand Russell did, who was a philosopher atheist in the 60s, he said, the universe is just a brute fact. It's just there. Has no beginning and no end. It's eternal. Just don't think about it. It's just a reality that's just a brute fact. If we conclude the way he has, then it leads to absurdities. Let me tell you why. Because if the universe didn't have a beginning and had no end, it would mean the universe is eternal. Which would mean that the universe has an infinite history. There's an infinite history of past events. But we ask the question, can there be an infinite of anything in the real world? No, they can't, because it leads to paradoxes and absurdities. Let me give an example. Say we have an infinite number of Stephen Laws in this room, okay? And say we take away 10 Stephen Laws away. How many Stephen Laws do we have left? Infinity or infinity minus 10. Whatever the case may be, in the practical real world, we should be able to count how many Stephen Laws are in this room, but we can't. So it leads to absurdities. Let me give another example. Say, for instance, we have 100 Stephen Laws in this room, and at every possible moment, we add another Stephen Law. Stephen Law 101, Stephen Law 1,000,001, Stephen Law 1,000,000,001, and so forth and so forth. Will I ever reach a number of Stephen Laws that I could describe as infinite? No, because we could always add another Stephen Law at every possible moment. This is why mathematicians Kasman and Newman, they said the infinite certainly doesn't exist in the same sense that there are fish in the sea. And the famous German mathematician David Hilbert, he said, the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely just of an idea. This is why the mathematicians say it only exists in the mathematical realm of discourse. You can't take the concept and extract it or export it into the real world. But let's go back to the universe. Can the history of the universe be infinite? No, it can't. Because the history of the universe, past events, are real things. So it necessitates that the universe can't be infinite because we described that the infinite can't be applied in the real world. Therefore, the universe must be finite. And if it's finite, it had a beginning. If it had a beginning, then it necessitates it has a cause. And this is also supported by astrophysical evidence, by scientific evidence. Has everyone heard of the Big Bang Theory? Put your hands up. Good. And it's not that thing that happens after too many curries, okay? Now, the Big Bang Theory, also known as the hot standard model, dictates to us that physical time and space were created. Matter and energy were also created at a point that cosmologists call singularity. In this light, John Boswell, the author of Stephen Hawking's universe, said, the biggest misunderstanding about the Big Bang is that it began as a lump of matter somewhere in the void of space. It was not just matter that was created during the Big Bang, it was space and time that were created. So in the sense that time has a beginning, space also has a beginning. So from a naturalistic perspective, the Big Bang would then imply that the universe was created out of nothing. However, there is a key, intuitive, undeniable philosophical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. This is why P.J. Swart, in his publication about time, explains, if there is anything that we can find as inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. So let's essentially summarize the first argument. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. And 3, which we conclude and makes it a sound and valid argument, that the universe has a cause. But all we know from this is that there's a cause for the universe. We can't say it's Jesus, or Allah, or God, or anything that we ascribe to this cause, something we've disagreed about for millennia, since 6000 BC Sumeria. We've attributed around 3,800 different types of descriptions to this cause if we study the history of religion. But I would argue, if we stick to the rational method of thinking and use something called conceptual analysis, big word I know, all it means is let's think very hard about this cause, okay? Let's think very hard. Okay, good. So if we think very hard about this cause, and since this cause created time and space, therefore it must be one. Because if we follow the philosophical principle of Occam's razor, which says do not multiply entities beyond necessity, because the most simplest explanation is the best explanation, therefore this cause must be one. Also, this cause must be uncaused, because of the absurdity of an infinite regress of events, similarly with causes. And I'll give you an example. If I wanted to shoot, I don't know, Gaddafi? Right? I wanted to shoot Gaddafi, for instance. Not that I'm inciting anyone to do that, of course. It's a hypothetical scenario. Never met him before. Never had tea with him either. Thank God, someone may say. So say I wanted to shoot Gaddafi, and in order for me to shoot Gaddafi, I have to ask permission for the guy behind me. Can I shoot Gaddafi? And he says, you know what? I have to ask permission too. If that goes on forever, am I ever going to shoot Gaddafi? No. This is why, by rational necessity, this cause must be uncaused. Also, this cause must be immaterial and transcendent. Because if it created time and space, it must therefore transcend time and space. In other words, this cause exists non-spatially and atemporally. So the logical conclusion is that this cause must be immaterial because all material things exist within time and space. Finally, and most significantly, this cause must have a will, which means it can have a relationship with personal agents in the universe. Because if this cause is uncaused, therefore eternal, and it brought into existence a finite effect, such as the universe, therefore it must have chosen the universe to come into existence. And choice indicates a will, and a will indicates that it can have a personal relationship with personal agents in the universe. So therefore, upon our rational analysis, the logic we've used in conceptual analysis, we can conclude what Islam concluded 1400 years ago in the book called the Quran. In the 112th chapter, it says, say, He is God, the one and only, God the eternal, absolute. He begets not, nor was he begotten, and there is nothing like unto him. So in essence, God is one, unique, eternal, immaterial, etc., etc. But before I get to the second argument, I want us to have a nuanced discussion. So I want to provide some counter arguments with regards to the first argument. So we have a bit of more of a nuanced, detailed discussion. One of the arguments to my first argument is about quantum vacuum. Because some physicists, they claim that there are subatomic events in the quantum vacuum that do not correspond with causality. They behave very unpredictably, so they conclude that things that begin to exist don't always have a cause. So it undermines my first argument. However, let me respond to this. Firstly, the claim is misleading because the vacuum is not nothing. Rather, it's a sea of fluctuating energy that obeys the laws of the universe. Secondly, there are many physicists that are adopting a deterministic approach to quantum theory, such as the David Bohm interpretation. They're moving away from the Copenhagen interpretation about this kind of spontaneous events in the quantum field. So it doesn't really undermine our first argument. Also, the other argument, which I think is slightly childish, but a lot of philosophers still use this argument, is, well, who created God? Who created the cause that caused the cause for the universe? Well, let's follow that thinking. Well, who created that cause that apparently created the cause that caused the cause of the universe? Well, then who created that cause that caused that cause that caused that cause that caused that cause that caused that cause that created the cause of the universe? And if we go on forever, are we ever going to have the universe? No. So the question itself denies our very existence. So let's go to the second argument, the nature of the Quran. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, when we probe and investigate the nature of the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, we will conclude that it is an act of impossibility. And this concept, which is an act of impossibility, is in line with the coherent definition of what is a miracle. What it really means is that when we exhaust all possibilities in the natural world, all logical possibilities in the natural world, and still can't find an explanation, then it's a sign, it's an indication to the divine or to the supernatural. And I would discuss this in the following way. I would use numerical, historical, and natural phenomena or scientific statements in the Quran, not to the natural world, but to the supernatural reality. Let's start with numerical. Now, first and foremost, the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, was revealed around 1400 years ago. Many of its 6,000 plus verses were revealed instantaneously to address problems and concerns of people at that time. This process lasted 23 years. In light of this, how do we explain the numerical consonants, the numerical coherence of the Quran, and how do we explain this in the context that there was no computers at the time, there was no calculators, and there was an ability that was absent with regards to storing the Quran in a mathematical type of way. For instance, the Quran mentions world 115 times and mentions the hereafter 115 times. Paradise and hell are mentioned and repeated 77 times each. The words wine, al-khamr, and intoxication are repeated the same amount of times, 6. The words man and women are employed equally 23 times. Also, if we go to the largest chapter of the Quran, which is the second chapter, Surah Baqarah, chapter the cow, it has 286 verses. They were revealed over a 9-year period and then put together in a coherent way. And when we go into the middle of that chapter, which is the 143rd verse, we find the word middle. So, since the Quran was primarily an oral phenomenon and its verses were revealed instantaneously to address unprecedented events, what does this say about the author? This indicates for me it's an act of impossibility, as there is no sufficient naturalistic explanation for the occurrence of such numerical consistency. The least we can say, brothers, sisters, and friends, it is that it's extremely unlikely that an illiterate man could have produced such work in absence of calculators and computers. Let's go to the historical aspects. Now, the Quran mentions 2 titles for the leader of the Egyptians, and these titles are used in 2 specific eras. For instance, at the era of Joseph, of Yusuf alayhi salam, the title is Al-Malik, the king. And for the era of Moses, the title of the leader of the Egyptian is called Pharaoh, Fir'aun in Arabic. Now, why does the Quran make this minute differentiation specifically to these different periods? Well, we know that these 2 different titles were used at 2 different periods. And we only know this because we had access to the Rosetta Stone that made us translate the hieroglyphic works. And we could find this out even if we refer to, for example, the Encyclopedia Britannica. My question is, how could the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, have known such minute historical detail, especially when all the other religious and historical texts just mentioned Pharaoh and not Malik, the king? Since people of the time of Revelation did not know this information or had access to the Rosetta Stone, what does this say about the authorship of the Quran? We can't find a naturalistic explanation. Now let's go to scientific. Now there's many verses in the Quran that talk about natural phenomena. It tells us to reflect and think. For instance, the Quran uses the word يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, which means for those who reflect deeply, who probe the universe. And these verses are approximately 1,000 in number that directly deal with natural phenomena. And for instance, the Quran mentions the element, the element iron. And it says something very interesting about it. It says, and we have sent down iron in which there lies a great force and which has many uses for mankind. The key word here is sent down, anzalna, which literally means being physically sent down from the sky. Now, from scientific perspective, this is actually bizarrely true. For example, Priscilla Frisch, in her article, The Galactic Environment of the Sun, states, an enhanced presence of this isotope, referring to the isotope of iron, in a geological layer indicates the recent nucleosynthesis of elements nearby in space and their subsequent transport to the earth. How could have the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, known such a thing? Also, the function and structure of mountains. The Quran mentions that mountains have peg-like structures, that they have been embedded in the earth to prevent the earth from moving underneath it. Now, the Quran mentions it in the following way. We have placed firmly embedded mountains on the earth so it would not move under them. Also, the Quran says, have we not made the earth as a bed and the mountains as its pegs? Now, this has only been recently understood at the end of the 20th century. For instance, in the book Earth by Dr. Frank Press, he discusses and says, actually, mountains have stake or peg-like structures, and he uses these words. And they're around 7 to 10 to 15 times the size of the original mountain above the earth. And its function, which is quite amazing, its function is to provide an almost fulcrum point to create stability, something which the geologists call isostasy. This is why Professor Sivieda, he says, the fundamental difference between continental mountains and oceanic mountains lies in its material. But the common denominator on both mountains is that they have roots to support the mountains. And we could find the concept of isostasy in M.J. Selby's book, Earth's Changing Surface. So, how do we explain this in light of the fact that it's relatively recent science? No one at the time of revelation knew this information, guessed it, fathomed it, discussed it, or even wrote it in poetry. Yeah. And we didn't even have the equipment to know such information. What does it say about the author? For me, we've exhausted naturalistic explanations, and it gives us good reasons to believe in the Quran. So let me just finally conclude. Although we could have good rational reasons to support the Islamic worldview, I would argue that without religion, without God, without Islam, life is absurd anyway. We are in a state of existential angst. And let me explain why. First and foremost, we may have meaning to our lives, but there is no ultimate meaning. If our ends are the same, we just pass out of existence, what meaning does that give to our lives ultimately? Does it matter if we existed at all? If the universe didn't exist, would it make a difference? This is why the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, he wished that the universe never existed. He even wrote an essay on suicide. Also, is there ultimate value? And the key word here is ultimate. I'm not saying you don't have value in your life, but you don't have ultimate value, philosophically speaking. Because if our lives really end in the grave, if I become worm buffet, yeah? And there's plenty of me around for the worms, yeah? If I become worm buffet, what difference does it make? If Stephen Law lived his life as an angel, and he's an angel, and if I live my life as a devil, right? What difference does it make if our ends are the same? Does it matter if some politician was trying to find answers to world peace, or the biomedic trying to find cure to cancer? It doesn't ultimately mean anything. Also, there are no objective moral values, which is going to create an amazing discussion today, I assume. And what I mean by objectives is that they exist outside of the mind. They transcend social consensus, because the humanist narrative, no matter how you philosophically justify it, is always going to rely on social pressure or fellow feeling or coming togetherness and coming to answers. For me, I can't take that, because that would justify 6 million Jews being killed in Nazi Germany, because the social pressure was there. The social consensus was there. So this is why we need an objective moral anchor. And the only concept that transcends human subjectivity is the concept of God. Now, if we're really true to our beliefs, as some atheists are, just like the Professor J.L. Mackie in his book Ethics, he said there are no true objective morals. It's just all relative. And if they're all relative, then you can't really have really strong claims against religious values or any other type of values, because it's just relative in nature. Finally, we don't have any ultimate purpose. We may have purpose, but no ultimate purpose. Because according to an interpretation of the atheistic worldview, our life is purposeless. We're just miscarriages of nature, brothers, sisters, and friends. We are, aren't we? Really? We're just accidental byproducts of some kind of cosmic process. We're like nature's abortion. That's the reality. Or at best, we're here to propagate our DNA. If we read the book from, what's his name? He's the prophet of neo-atheism. Richard Dawkins, yes. As they say, atheism is a non-profit organization. So, essentially, Richard Dawkins says in his book, The Selfish Gene, he says, we're here just to propagate our DNA. So, how do we provide some ultimate purpose in life? Well, the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, you know what? We find a way out. We remove God out of the picture, then we say everything is based on nothingness. And from nothingness, we could create new meaning for our lives. But for me, that's self-delusion. That's basically saying to me, let's pretend to have purpose. That's what it's saying. So, it is no wonder, in my humble opinion, that the Quran says, and I'll say the Arabic, because in Islam we believe Arabic is a healing for everybody. And it's quite funny, there were some studies made which transcended religious affiliation. The sounds of the Quran and classical music, and the sounds of the Quran provided more healing than classical music, even though you didn't understand the Arabic. So I'm doing it as a sign of human love. The Quran says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اسْتَجِيبُوا لِلَّهِ وَلِرُسُولِهِ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُمْ. Respond to the call of God and His Messenger to that which gives you life. Because if you really think about it, if you respond to the atheist call, do you really have a life? Or is it self-delusion? Thank you very much for listening.
I did give Hamzah an extra 3.5 minutes. So I'd like to call Dr. Stephen Law to the podium, and you can have your 23.5 minutes.
Really to make a case for atheism. I am an atheist, I'm afraid. Any atheists in this room other than me? Be interested to see. Oh, a few. Yeah. Good. So, making a case for atheism. Well, let me begin by setting out the kind of God, in particular, that I certainly don't believe in. The kind of God I'm going to focus on is the God of classical monotheism, the kind of God that Jews and Christians and Muslims all believe in, a God that is supposed to be something like a person, someone who is all-powerful, supremely powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, and supremely good or benevolent. God has at least these three characteristics. And it seems to me that it's very unlikely that there's anything like that outside of the universe, or anything like that that is the creator of the universe. I'm happy to admit that I don't know the answer to the question, why is there anything at all? But I can be pretty confident that certain answers are incorrect, and I'm pretty damn confident that this particular being is not responsible, is not the explanation. So let me set out my reasons, some of my reasons. I can only do it very briefly. There's no doubt that human beings are drawn to the idea that there's agency operating in the world. By agency, I mean something like a person, a being with beliefs and desires on which they might more or less rationally act. We are agents, and we attribute a certain amount of agency to other species, to monkeys and cats and dogs and so on, and occasionally to machines. But for the most part, we suppose that the natural world is free of agents until we hit a mystery, when suddenly it becomes very tempting to suppose that there must be some agent back there after all. So, for example, when we couldn't explain the movements of the heavenly bodies, the rather peculiar motions that they make, we suppose that there must be beings up there, agents of some sort, gods that move them around, and that's the explanation for their otherwise inexplicable behaviour. When we were baffled by the way in which living things grow, we didn't know the naturalistic explanation. We supposed that there must be invisible beings of some sort operating behind the scenes, sprites or fairies or something like that, pushing the plants up and causing them to grow. And when we couldn't explain natural disasters and terrible illnesses and so on, and we didn't know the naturalistic explanation, we supposed that there must be demons or witches operating behind the scenes, and it was their activities and their malevolent desires that were the explanation for what we saw going on. Now, of course, as things have progressed, as science has progressed, we've come to understand more and more about how the world works. And we know that we don't need witches and demons and fairies and sprites and gods in the sky to move the planets around anymore. All of those things have perfectly good naturalistic explanations. But still, the temptation is always very strong. We're increasingly understanding why the temptation is so psychologically strong in human beings now. We'll talk about that maybe a bit later on. But there is this very strong temptation when we're faced with a question we don't know the answer to suppose that there's somebody back there that did it. Some kind of invisible person is responsible. And of course, there are always going to be questions we can't answer, and perhaps the question, why is there anything at all, is such a question. And of course, it's then immediately very tempting. The first thing we turn to, the first thought that pops into our head when we ask ourselves that question and we can't figure out what the answer could possibly be, we think, somebody did it. There's a person back there that's responsible. Well, now maybe there is. I rather doubt it. But maybe there's a person back there that created the universe. What I'm going to suggest is that even if we know that the universe has a cause, which I rather doubt, even if we know that the cause is some sort of necessary being, which I rather doubt, even if we suppose that this cause is something like a person, frankly, I'm not sure I can even make sense of that suggestion, a person outside of time and space, but hey, let's go with that. I think we nevertheless have overwhelming empirical evidence that that person, if it's there at all, is not the traditional God of monotheism. I think we can establish that pretty conclusively just by looking around us. So how might we do that? Well, you might do this. You'll have heard this a million times before, but hopefully I'll give it a new twist for you. We might look at the amount of pain and suffering that there is in the universe, the amount of moral evil that there is. I'm sure very many of you have thought about the problem of evil. And there are, of course, many explanations which theists have developed which they think can deal with the problem. And I'm going to approach the problem in such a way that I hope it will raise some questions in your mind about whether these explanations are actually really adequate. So, here we go. Not very long ago, I watched a program. How are we doing for time, by the way? Am I okay? How long have I got? I want to pace myself, so
17 minutes.
Oh, right, okay. So, who watched David Attenborough's program Life recently? Any of you watched that? Yeah. Did you watch the one involving Komodo dragons? Any of you? Do you remember that one? That was absolutely horrific. It was just the most depressing program. What they did was they went to this island where these big lizard-like creatures wander around, and they filmed a Komodo dragon bite a water buffalo on the ankle. And the water buffalo just kind of shrugged it off and walked away. But what we don't realise at the time is that what the Komodo dragon has done is it's poisoned the water buffalo. And it's going to take about 2 weeks for the water buffalo to die. So the water buffalo gradually starts to get weaker and weaker. And then other Komodo dragons begin to appear and follow the water buffalo around. And they start nipping at it. It becomes weaker still. After the most appalling suffering, the thing finally gets eaten alive by the Komodo dragons. When the photographer This was his first assignment for one of his photographers. When he was asked about what it was like to film this afterwards, he said that he was probably going to have to give up wildlife photography because it was just so utterly appalling. Nature is beautiful, but nature is unbelievably cruel beyond your imagination. This was just one creature suffering the most appalling way over a 2-week period. This kind of thing has been going on for hundreds of millions of years on a global scale before we even showed up. This is a horrifically cruel world. There's plenty of nice stuff in it, but do not underestimate just how horrific and unpleasant this world is for very many of the sentient inhabitants now and that have existed over hundreds of millions of years, including our predecessors. So that looks to me like pretty good evidence that if the world, if the universe is the creation of some sort of superperson, assuming that even makes any kind of sense, some sort of superperson, then this superperson is, well, either not all powerful, because they surely could have done could have produced less suffering, or they're not all knowing because they don't know about the suffering, or they're not supremely benevolent, because no supremely benevolent being would do that. They might put some suffering in the world for the sake of certain greater goods. What I'm focusing on is the quantity. And of course there's human suffering too. You don't need me to remind you about it. There are children buried alive in earthquakes. There are people dying in the most horrific way from diseases, natural disasters and so on. It's shocking. It's staggering how much cruelty and suffering this world contains. And then there's moral evil too. There's the evil that we do to each other. You know, the cliches are the Holocaust and so on, but even setting those cases aside, we know that on a daily basis, human beings do to other human beings just stupendously cruel and morally depraved things. So it seems to me that, you know, if there is somebody up there, either he's not all powerful and all knowing, or he's not supremely benevolent. This is very good evidence. Now, when people say that kind of thing, which they do a lot, don't they? It's not like you haven't heard this before. There are various explanations that people come up with for all this cruelty and suffering and so on. What might those explanations be? Let's hear from you now. How might we attempt to deal with some of these problems? Yeah.
Okay, well,
you talk and I'm going to drink my coffee. Karen.
Okay, basically, someone proposed an example to me when they said that if you have a light bulb that's not working, the bulb's not working, you replace it with a new bulb. But you wouldn't replace it with a broken bulb because it still wouldn't work. And then if you replaced it again, you wouldn't replace it with a broken bulb because it still wouldn't work. And then you would replace it with a bulb that does work so that the light will come on. So the problem is not with the socket that you put the bulb in, it's with the bulb itself. So in the same way, you can say that the problem is not with God, but the problem is with us ourselves.
Right. This sounds, I might have misunderstood, so correct me if I'm wrong. So you're saying the problem is with us, the pain and the suffering.
I'm saying that if we obeyed what we're told to obey, there would be
no earthquakes.
Not that there would be no earthquakes, there would be no pain and suffering that we inflict on one another.
Okay, now this is good. You can try and explain away some of the pain and suffering by saying, well, it's the result, you know, the Holocaust wars. It's the result of human activity. We have been given free will, yeah, and free will is itself for very great good, and it allows for the very great good of human beings doing good of their own volition. Now, God could have made us puppet beings, couldn't he? He could have, you know, kept us on strings and made us always do the right thing, always do the good thing. But that wouldn't be true moral goodness, because we wouldn't be free moral agents. We wouldn't be doing it of our own volition. What God wants is for us to do good of our own volition. That's true moral goodness. And you can't have that unless you cut the strings. But of course the downside to cutting the strings is that we may then go and hurt each other and do terrible things. And So that's the price that God has to pay for the pain and suffering that we cause each other. I'll come back to that, because it's an interesting suggestion. But notice straight away that it doesn't explain natural evils as they're known. It doesn't explain why children are buried alive. It doesn't explain hundreds of millions of years of the most appalling suffering before human beings even appeared on the face of the planet, because we weren't around. And I'm pretty sure that earthquakes are still going to happen even if we behave ourselves. So, you know, you can't put all of that down to free will, but perhaps some of it. Okay. Any other explanations on offer? Because that's, you know, it's a good one. We're going to stick it on the list, and I'll come back to it. But maybe we should add a few more. Any other suggestions? Yes.
Well, basically, if God wanted a species which were free from sin and imperfection, He would have increased the number of angels that were in submission. Rather, we, with the absence of complete submission, have free will. And through this, we are tested. Although we are inclined to sin, it is through our sin and our repentance that God's manifestation of His attribute of forgiveness becomes.
Okay. So, God's forgiveness is a very great good, and He can't do it unless He's got some sinners to forgive. So He makes us sinners, or sets us free knowing that we'll sin. Is that the explanation?
We can sin, and we can abstain from sin. This is the difference between us and the angels, who are in complete submission.
Right.
If we do follow the commandments of our Lord, then we can excel to a higher stage.
Okay, so this is really a variant of the free will defence then. We've been given free will, and we can reject God, disobey, and that's the explanation for why there's bad stuff. But another benefit is that God then gets to forgive us, which is perhaps a very great good, which again somehow compensates for the bad stuff. Something like that. There are variants here, but maybe something like that. Any other explanations? That are not free will type explanations. Any other? Seems we've done free will. Yep.
Okay, so you mentioned about the buffalo and the Komodo dragons.
Yeah.
And the Komodo dragons eating away at the buffalo and how it was an evil act. But in the same way, could you not say that the evil act towards the buffalo is not indeed an act of mercy towards the Komodo dragons?
Yeah.
Because otherwise
they're going to starve. The Komodo dragons. There's a balance in nature, isn't there? If the lions don't eat the antelopes, well, they're going to starve, and their babies are going to starve. So, yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I suppose we might ask why God designed a system in which things have to tear each other limb from limb in order to survive. I mean, why would you do that? If you're a supremely benevolent being, would you, if you cared about the creatures you were producing, produce creatures that in order to survive had to physically tear each other limb from limb?
It seems as if you're just answering my question, you get more questions. You're supposed to be answering.
Okay. Well, what I'm doing is I'm explaining why I find your answer completely inadequate, and I've given you a reason why. I've given you an analogy. What would you do if you were creating beings? Would you create beings and you cared about them and you had the power to create them however you want? Would you create them so that they tore each other limb from limb in order to survive?
If I had the power to create anything however I wanted, then I would make it exactly how I wanted. If that's how I wanted it, then that's how I would make it.
But if you were good, would you want that? You've said if you wanted it, then you'd create it like how you want it. Of course you would. But if you were genuinely good and caring, would you want creatures to tear each other limb from limb? Would you?
Based on the society that we live in, it's wrong to tear people limb from limb, but animals don't have the same laws as we. If a lion kills someone...
Yeah, I'm not saying they're immoral for doing what they do, because they're not moral agents. What I'm saying is that what they do produces unbelievable pain and suffering, on a global scale, beyond our comprehension. is that something that a supremely benevolent being would create?
It doesn't only create pain and suffering, it also creates survival. The Komodo dragons can live on, and so can the buffaloes as well. So it's
Well, not that one.
It's not that one in particular.
No, but why would you create creatures that need to tear each other limb from limb in the first place? Why would you do that?
You tell me.
I can't explain it. It seems to me this is overwhelming evidence that there's no God of the sort. I wouldn't have created them like that if I actually cared about them. If I had some other interest in producing beings, like, you know, cruelty or just interested in see what happens, well then it wouldn't bother me that the creatures were doing this to each other. But if I was genuinely a God, you know, a compassionate God, that's the last thing I would do. The last thing. Yeah, yeah. Do you know what? I've only got 5 minutes left. I've suddenly gone on and on. It's been very interesting, this bit. We can have more questions later. Let me just finish off now. Sorry?
It's turned into a Q&A.
Yeah, it has already. So let me finish off because I've got to do the analogy as quickly as I can now. So there are different explanations which people come up with for why there's so much pain and suffering, and we've looked at some of them, and we could look at a lot more. Another suggestion is that this is some sort of character building exercise. You know, God puts us through the mill here to give us the opportunity to become noble, better people, to give us opportunities to overcome problems and so on. So he's got to give us the problems in the first place in order that we may overcome them. So all sorts of explanations, character building, free will, laws of nature theodicies. I haven't got time. There are hundreds of them, literally hundreds of them. Let's now consider another hypothesis for a moment, just to finish off. My hypothesis is this. Let's suppose that there is no good God. There's just an all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely evil God. Okay? I know it's not true. Just suppose, for the moment, that there is such a being. Suppose I believed in a being like that. Now, what would you say about that belief? I suspect you would say, Stephen, you're insane. Why on earth? Yes. Why on earth? Why would you believe that? Remember you said that. Right? Why would you believe in such a being? Well, I could say this. Well, look, there must be a kind of first cause that's a necessary being that's kind of designed the universe and that explains all the complexity that there is in it. And so that's my evil God did all of that. And of course, because the standard cosmological arguments and arguments from design are completely neutral on the moral properties of God, they do indeed support belief in my evil God just as much as they support belief in Hamza's good God. Those arguments are completely neutral on the God question. Those ones. There may be others that are not, but those ones are. So I'll help myself to those arguments. But still you won't believe that there's an evil God. Why? Well, the most obvious reason is there's too much good stuff in the universe. Why is there love and laughter and rainbows? Why is there ice cream? I mean, I know there's a lot of bad stuff, right, in the universe, but there's way too much good stuff. There's overwhelming quantities of good stuff as well as bad stuff, and that is overwhelming evidence that there is no evil God. That's called the evidential problem of good, and it's just the mirror problem to the evidential problem of evil. If you believe in a good God, you've got to explain all the bad stuff. If you believe in a bad God, you've got to explain all the good stuff. Too much good stuff. And most of you can see straight away there really is too much good stuff for this to be the creation of an evil God. But what if I do this? You're being far too quick and dismissive. Think about it. Think about what an evil God would want. He would want moral agents doing evil of their own volition. Moral evil is the worst kind of evil that there is. Right? You can only have moral evil if evil God cuts our strings and sets us free. We have to choose to do it. Evil. Now, the downside of evil gods cutting our strings is that we'll sometimes choose to do good stuff. And that's why there is good. That's why people help each other. Evil God hates it. It makes him sick. But it's the price he has to pay in order for there to be true moral depravity in the universe. Otherwise, it couldn't exist. I've just run the standard theodicy, free will theodicy, in reverse. Okay, I've mirrored it. Works just the same. If you don't like that, well then, what about this isn't a character building exercise. This isn't a great big school to make us all better. This is an exercise in soul destruction. Why does an evil God give us healthy, fit young bodies? Why would he do that? Surely he'd torture us for all eternity with a red hot poker? Well, the reason is because if he gives you a fit, healthy young body for about 10 or 15 years, he can then take it away from you so that you slowly and inexorably slide into decay and decrepitude and die in agony, having lived out a short, and ultimately meaningless existence. That is far worse than if you never had a fit young body in the first place. Why would he give David Beckham loads and loads of money and a new Ferrari to make the rest of you feel worse? Who can rest content when you know that a few people have so much that they don't deserve it, that you'll never have it no matter how hard you work? It's a recipe for endless torment and suffering. That's why evil God gives a few people great stuff. And so on. Most of the standard theodicies can be flipped around in this way. And if you don't like those, then I could just play the mystery card and say, who are you to think that you know the mind of God? Evil God, that is. This really is the worst of all possible worlds. It's just that you, being a mere human being, can't see that. Of course you can't. How could you? Why should you expect to? Of course, evil God's plans are going to be beyond your understanding. This really is as bad as it could possibly be, and the only reason that you can't say that is because you're a mere human being. God's interrupting me. It's reminding me that I'm exceeding my limit. Yeah. So, what I'm pointing out to you is that these explanations, when you reverse them, people laugh at them and go, yeah, right, pull the other one. It's obvious there's no evil God. And in fact, it is obvious. And in fact, I was told that I was insane to believe it. Well, maybe not quite as, maybe insanity is not quite, maybe that's a little bit too strong. But the fact is, it's just downright irrational, frankly, for a grown-up person to believe in an evil God. And my challenge really is this: if you think that belief in an evil God is pretty unreasonable, and it is, why do you think that belief in a good God is significantly more reasonable? Why? I mean, show me the asymmetry between the two hypotheses. If one hypothesis is really pretty silly, why is the other one so much more sensible? Well, Hamza thinks he's got some reasons. We'll look at them a bit later on. Here's the punchline. Suppose you're Sherlock Holmes, right? The famous detective. You're told that you have to solve the case, but you can't. You can't solve the case. You can't figure out who done it. It doesn't follow that you can't rule certain people out. Okay? You might know that the butler didn't do it because he was in the room with you at the time, or he has a cast iron alibi. Even when you can't answer a question, it doesn't mean that you can't can't cross certain answers off your list. Similarly, I can't explain to you why the universe exists. It's a fascinating question. I am genuinely interested in it. I've done quite a bit of work on it now. Even though I don't know the answer, I can be damn sure that this isn't the creation of an evil God. Can't I? And so can all of you. All of you are damn sure about that. But if you're damn sure about that, well, why couldn't it be reasonable then, on the basis of just looking around us, to believe that there ain't no good God either? That's my talk. Sorry it went on too long. So.
Thanks for that, Dr. Stephen Law. I did let Stephen go on for an extra 2.5 minutes. I'm not quite sure if that was good or evil of me. Maybe we can talk about that later. Hamza, if you'd like to give your 10-minute response.
Presentation reminds me of one of Richard Dawkins' programs when he didn't really want to discuss with adults or with people or philosophers. He picked on 12-year-old girls and said, "Why don't you believe in evolution? You're so dumb. Believe in me." That was the kind of the display of some forms of atheist arrogance, in my opinion. And the reason I'm saying this is because there's a big issue here. And the issue is, if we even were to take the atheist narrative on the world, and he was very moved by lizards tearing their fleshes apart. He was almost about to cry, which means he has humanistic tendencies, yeah? And if there were animals, therefore he might have animalistic tendencies too. So the point I'm trying to say is, that's good, but the point is, I have a very dark view in the world. It's no wonder the atheist moral philosophers, they wrote essays on suicide. They said the greatest question is, shall we suicide? Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, would say, if you want to get along in life, you have to get over the fact that we're just a cosmic orphan. That's the reality, people. But I think that's very sad. And take motherhood as an example. My wife, she went through 42 hours of labor. 3-minute contractions from the beginning. 42 hours of labor. Towards the end, her mother had to get out of the room because her mother was a very strong woman. She's gone through the death of her husband, she's gone through lots of issues. And she had to leave. I was there on my own in the last 12 hours. And I see my son's heartbeat go. I see my wife, she's about to die. Emergency people come in to try and fix the problem. I'm ready for funerals. Once my son was born, what did my wife say? She said she'd do it again 100 times. This is the reality of the theist. This is the reality of the atheist. You have a bleak world, you have no power. You can't empower yourself. Because we have conceptual tools that come from revelation to teach us that there are wisdom behind these things. Because what Stephen Law has done is a straw man, logical fallacy. He committed a person like myself to a particular view, and I don't hold these views. I don't only believe that God is good. I don't only believe He's all-powerful. In Islam, this is why I mentioned Revelation, because it undercuts his argument. Because we don't say we know God from nature. The only thing we can know about a cause for the universe is that He's one, eternal, unique, immaterial, transcendent, which is based upon conceptual analysis. Anything else, we raise our hands and we can't claim anything. It's like a knocking on the door. We don't know who's behind the door. There's something behind the door. It transcends the room. It's outside of the room, etc., etc. We can't attribute goodness or evil to this being. It tells us. And we know that from Revelation. And this is why I gave a good response or good reasons to believe in the Quran, which is the book of the Muslims. Scientific, numerical, historical reasons to show that you can't find naturalistic explanations. So we know who God is, not just by looking at the world, because when you look at the world, what do you have? You have particular glasses. If you're a pessimist, the world's going to be bad. Okay, it's going to be a Stephen Law type of world, right? If you're an optimist, you know, like me, my dad's Greek, he's a bit crazy, yeah? You're like, everything's great, pain, yeah, let's have more pain, yeah? But do you see the reality? You bring some concepts or some intellectual and historical baggage to your experience. So it's like subjective. But I think the best way to undermine the whole argument is in the following way. See, the problem of evil assumes there's moral properties. They assume that there are such things as good and evil. And for an atheist to make that would be inaccurate. Because to claim that things are objectively evil, they're really evil, look, they're killing each other, yeah? Look, there's earthquakes, babies are dying. If these are really objective in nature, it necessitates God's existence. If we study moral ontology, we need an ontological foundation for objective morals. Atheism doesn't do that. So what he's done, he's questioned, his own question requires the existence of God. Do you see? You don't have to explain why this happens. This is a question we'll have all the time, but it doesn't negate God's existence. Do you see? Because in atheism, you just have two moral ontological foundations: social pressure or evolution. If there's more, we could discuss it. Social pressure, well, we know the problems. Nazi Germany, that means that must be a good thing then, right? Because it's social pressure. Or God knows what's going to happen in 20 years' time. There's an organization called NAMBLA, the North American Men Lover Boys Association. They're using UN human rights legislation to essentially allow older men to sleep with 4-year-old boys. They're using it. That might happen in the future because it's based on social pressure. That's the reality. So the thing is, if it's based on social pressure, objective marriage doesn't mean anything because it changes. Anyone studying social theory or social constructionism will see society moves along. Also, what about evolution as an ontological foundation for objective morality? Well, that can't be the case because we're just byproducts of a lengthy biological process. Our morals have evolved like our ears or teeth, or your unwanted hair. They don't have any true meaning. This is why philosophers of science, and he was an atheist by the way, Michael Rules, he says when you say love thy neighbor as thyself, you think you're referring above and beyond yourself, but it has no true meaning. It has no true meaning. It's just pegged on biology, that's going to change, your morals are going to change. No wonder Darwin said, if we were to evolve like the sharks, then it would be morally okay to rape women. Because that's how they evolved. They forced themselves on their mates. So the way to really undermine the whole argument is saying you've assumed moral properties, and in doing that, if you're assuming the objective, then you can't do that because that requires God's existence in the first place. And if you say no, they're not objective, then it's a subjective argument. It's just probabilistic, which doesn't really give any good grounding as an argument itself, because then I could say, well, I could still perceive rationally in any scenario that good is always going to prevail. And it depends on what kind of approach you have. What kind of glasses do you have to view the world? What concepts, what innate concepts do you bring to experience? So I think the way to deal with it, I want to discuss in the Q&A more because I have many more answers, but the way to deal with it fundamentally is by saying you've assumed moral properties, you've assumed the real and objective, the outside of human subjectivity. If that is the case, you've necessitated God's existence because God is the only conceptual anchor that transcends human subjectivity. Also, you did another argument which is called God of the gaps. Oh, we can't find any answers, explanations, so we just squeeze God in there. That's an outdated atheist cliche because I didn't start with a question and say we can't find an answer, therefore it's God. We didn't do that. What we did, we probed the universe, used logic, reason, scientific naturalism, conceptual analysis, and moved together to a conclusion that there must be a cause to the universe because, look, if you study logic, you see it's a sound and valid argument. 1, whatever begins to exist is a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe is a cause. And upon conceptual analysis, we come to the understanding that this cause must be one, eternal, unique, immaterial, and it has a will. That's a sound argument. That's a valid argument. It's based on reasoning. It's not God of the gaps. It wasn't a question. I started with a question and said, therefore it must be God. We moved together. And once we concluded there's a cause of these attributes, then we said, oh my God, they're so in line with the Quranic view of God. And I gave you the essential chapter that describes God's existence and his oneness, etc.
The universe, the universe must have an uncaused cause. So, and you said that you don't know why there is something rather than nothing, but you rather doubt that there is a superficial power that would cause the universe to be there. So you don't have any evidence that God doesn't exist. So how would you respond to this?
Yeah.
And the second thing.
Can I just do with that one first? Because I mean, forget it.
Just about the evil, that I think the concept of good and evil.
You have to write it down because I'm going to lose this. So the
Yeah,
first question is.
Well, we'll stick to one question, brother, because otherwise it's going to be unfair on everyone else who wants to ask questions. Yeah?
I've already forgotten the first one. So the first question was, well, God. Just put it in a sentence for me.
I'm just saying it's quite an ignorant attitude when, by rational thinking, we know or we are convinced that the universe must have uncaused cause, otherwise we cannot explain it in other ways. So then you doubt that there is a superficial power. So why? What is your evidence that God does not exist?
Well, I said right at the beginning I was talking about one specific God, the one that Hamzah, for example, believes in. And I suggested that there was overwhelming empirical evidence that that God, a God like that, does not exist. I pointed out that just because Sherlock Holmes can't answer a question doesn't mean that he can't conclusively rule out certain suspects. That's true, isn't it? Sherlock Holmes, he doesn't know who done it, he doesn't know the answer to the question who done it, he might still know who didn't, mightn't he? Is that true?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Just because we can't answer a question, it doesn't follow that we can't know that certain answers are mistaken. I mean, Sherlock Holmes might not know who done it. He might not know who the murderer is. It's somebody in this room. I don't know who it is, but I know that he didn't do it because he was in the room. Sorry, thinking about that. He's a good guy, also. I know that he didn't do it because he was in the room with me at the time. I have overwhelming empirical evidence that he is not the guilty person, despite the fact that I don't actually know who is. Now, there are all sorts of God hypotheses we could consider, and all sorts of other hypotheses, non-God hypotheses we could consider, so far as explaining why there's something rather than nothing. And it seems to me that, you know, if this chap is the evil God hypothesis, well, I might not know the explanation for why there's anything at all, but I know that he didn't do it. And then if this guy is the good God, right, I might similarly have excellent evidence that he didn't do it either. I might not know what the answer is. I might not know who did it.
But the issue is that by rational thinking, we are convinced that there must be a superficial power that...
Yeah, maybe that's true. So maybe among all of these possible candidates for the cause of the universe, right, maybe, let's suppose that there must be one out there. Actually, I don't even buy that argument. I don't even accept that there's a good argument for there having to be some kind of supernatural first cause. I think even that argument is no good.
So
but even if, my point is this, that even if that were a good argument, which it probably isn't, even if it were, it wouldn't prevent me from having having a fantastically good argument that actually it wasn't this particular cause, and it wasn't that particular cause either. We could have overwhelming evidence that this universe, whatever caused it, and maybe it has a first cause, whatever the first cause is, it is not supremely evil being. We know that on the basis of just looking around us.
I think we'll move on to the second question. What
Okay.
I would say...
Very, very good question. See, what we believe in Islam, because Stephen Law makes a cartoon out of the argument, because in Islam we don't have a Christian concept of God. We don't just believe he's just good and all powerful. We believe he's the wise, he's the one he's al-latif, the subtle, he's the one who punishes, he's the one, etc., etc. So we have a whole corpus of 99 names and attributes that we reconcile with nature, do you see? So we believe that Quran tells us God created good and evil. He created everything in the universe. So fundamentally, from a metaphysical sense, he is the cause for good and evil. But the thing is, the underlying supposition of this is that we're here not to have a party. That's the assumption. We're not here to have a party, have a good time. We're not here to have a boogie, yeah? We are here to be tested. And that's just the reality of Islam. And we're tested with good and we're tested with evil. And it all comes from God. And that's our theology. Now, the caricature, the cartoon of the argument is, but you say he's all good. He can't be all good because it can't be all good. And I'm like, well, we don't say that, actually. We say he is good. We also say that he does what he wills. We also say that God is the one who punishes. We also say that God is the subtle. We also say God is the all-wise. And if there's wisdom behind everything, therefore that's actually an explanation, if you like. If you can't see the wisdom, you can't argue from ignorance anyway. That's a logical fallacy called argumentum ad ignorantiam. So it's a very, in a way, it's a Christian concept of God. We don't have that. We have 99 names and attributes that we could reconcile with nature. But even in saying this, David Hume was the famous agnostic, right? Agnostic stroke atheist. And in his dialogues, he was discussing about, you can't even make any analogy to God, whether he's good or evil, because he's weak. This is the reality of David Hume. David Hume said, you can't say anything about this cause. This is why he would deny the Christian and say, you can't say it's a Christian type of God. And in a way, David Hume, if he knew the Quran, he would have become a Muslim, in my opinion, because the Quran exactly says this. You can't attribute anything to this uncaused cause for the universe. You need revelation. You need the thing behind the door to tell you who it is. Anything else you say will be a weak analogy. You can't do that because he's supposed to be transcendent. Do you see? So, Stephen...
So just to continue that then, the one thing you didn't say there is if he calls all of that, the one thing that you said he is not, or you didn't say he was, is evil. Because all of the other things you mentioned, he is wise, he is good, is that if he made evil, he must have that characteristic as well.
No, we don't say that in Islam.
Then he could have made it.
Okay, let me tell you something. Why does it necessitate that if God created evil makes him evil? I don't see that is necessary. You need to show me how that makes it necessary. It's not necessary. Because then it becomes about perception as well. Because for example, as a kid, I could think my dad's evil for not giving me sweets. Yeah? I think, you're evil, man. Therefore, you're evil. You're making me, you don't let me have my sweeties. Does that mean he's evil? But after when I grow up, So when humans grow up, when adults grow up, we call growing up death. And we get to two realities. We get the justice of God and the mercy of God. And that's going to iron out itself in the future. Do you see? So in reality, that's a good analogy to show that even the creation of evil doesn't really mean his evil intrinsically. But our perception of evil has been used, so when we grow up as human beings, as the human family on the Day of Judgment, his ultimate justice and ultimate goodness manifests itself. And that's reconcilable.
We move on to a question from Dr. Stephen Law.
Can I ask you a question? Is there...
Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic.
Okay.
From what I can understand, a lot of your questions concerning the knowledge of God, which every person who thinks on this knows that God's knowledge is infinite. And our minds are small, just like that glass of water. You didn't create millions of atom bombs like the sun, the solar system, your liver, your heart, and all these complicated systems and beyond our comprehension. Is there something that you could say, because you've said how God may have done this or done that, you can't understand. Is there something that you could say, well, God did this to prove to me, what would prove to you of his existence? You know, because I was asking you, what is it would prove to you? Because you're saying these things seem to prove of his non-existence in your mind, like the dragon, what would prove to you in your mind of his existence? For instance, you had a personal conversation, said, oh, you show me this and I know that you exist, because he is beyond your comprehension, for sure. In your mind, you understand, in your human, what we have to show you.
Well, he would, I mean, I've wheeled out a couple of the problems I have with belief in this kind of God. I mean, there are various other problems I have too. And if God, I mean, so what's going to happen? I'm going to get a voice in my head?
No,
and he's going to say...
tell me what it was, the sign that you know that exists.
Well, he's got a lot of explaining to do. He's going to have to provide really pretty good explanations for why there is such horrendous pain and suffering in the universe. Of course, if he can just reveal to me that he exists in a direct and immediate way, then I wouldn't need those explanations because I would just know, because he's just revealed. But it's a kind of weird question, because in a way it kind of presupposes that there is one.
No. So if he just gave you a direct sign from him, you would accept that, wouldn't you? You just said you would. A
direct sign?
You just said if he gave you a direct sign from him, you would accept that.
No, I said he's got a lot of explaining to do.
No. As I said about understanding, my friend, you see this container, it can't take 50,000 litres. That wisdom that you're talking about, that knowledge, your mind can't.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
No.
But so you've got something that you can understand. Like
there are a number of things going on here. I mean, there's an appeal to what's known as skeptical theism. Skeptical theism is, oh dear, this is a really terrible problem. It looks like overwhelming evidence that there's no God. But hey, God's really big and I'm really tiny, and in some mysterious way, it's all for the best. I shouldn't expect to be able to understand it all because I am merely like a glass of water. Right? Now, so that's a standard, skeptical theistic move. It won't wash. I mean, I could give you several really good criticisms, but here's the most obvious one, given that we've talked about an evil God. If that's true, exactly the same move can be used to defend belief in an evil God. Exactly the same move can be made, because evil God, remember, is infinitely knowledgeable and intelligent. I mean, his ingenuity, that's the right word, knows no bounds so far as maximising suffering. So, of course, if you spot things in this world that look too good for there to be such an evil God, just remember, his intelligence exceeds yours by, a factor of whatever, infinity, if only there was such a thing. Exactly the same explanation, you see. Now it's perfectly clear that that's just a lot of evasive nonsense. I mean, the fact is there is overwhelming evidence that there ain't no evil God. And saying, oh yes, but in some mysterious way it can all be explained, I'm afraid that just doesn't wash with me. And I'm sure it doesn't wash with you when it comes to the evil God hypothesis. So the question then is, so why should we take that movement more seriously when it comes to the good God hypothesis? Sorry, talk to me afterwards about that. I want to hear what you think. Okay.
Questions from Hamzah? The very handsome gentleman to the left.
This is a question for. Can I just question the other chap just for a second?
Stephen Law?
Yeah, because I know what you believe, but I'm not quite sure. You? Yeah, I know what you believe.
Okay.
You made a good case for your belief, but I don't know why you think you're alive.
Why am I alive?
No. Why do you get up every day, and what do you think long term is the purpose and the reason for you being here?
The purpose of
for you personally.
What's the meaning of it all?
For you, only for you.
For me personally.
I think we'll get to that question.
Wow.
I'll let you think for a bit.
You said you're optimistic, so what are you optimistic?
So what we'll do, we'll have a question for Hamzah, because that's how it's working, and then we'll get to your question, and I'll pick you.
Either people can come down one side or the other, because I don't know about you people, but some people still believe that the Twin Towers were controlled demolition. Some people believe they were the planes. So we can't even decide on fact that's happened in front of our eyes. We can't find the truth.
It's just a lot of nonsense. No. The conspiracy theories are just...
You believe that?
No,
but
it's
how
a
many people
fact.
believe it was controlled demolition?
No. 100,000, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We can't even decide about earthly things.
You're making a mistake. Let me answer that question. You're making a mistake of supposing...
it's my time, sir.
Then you can get two. But this one was asked of me, so let me answer it.
You get your opportunity, surely. Let me respond to that, yeah? And the response is, you're right. All we could do is provide good reasons. That's why it's in the beginning. We could just provide good reasons, because yaqeen, the concept of yaqeen in Arabic terminology, in Islamic terminology, which is conviction, is not a conviction of the aql, of the intellect. It's a conviction of the heart. And this is a reality of all types of knowledge, because all types of knowledge fundamentally is self-knowledge. Do you see that? That's why the Quran tells us, أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect within themselves? For instance, why did Stephen Law interpret the Quranic verse for mountains and assume it was about the formation of mountains, whereas mine specifically was about the form and function, and gave 2 scientific papers behind it? Why did he go to that route? The reason, and let me tell you the reason he did that, because you know what, there's answers to all these questions, yeah? But we have to humble ourselves, and the reason is because human beings are in a state of arrogance. That is the reality. Human beings, whether you're Muslim, atheist, whatever you are, we're in a state of ego. And that's a spiritual reality. You talk to existentialists, they didn't even believe in God, but they had a concept of the self. What is the self? And what we need to do is understand how do we break the ego to understand where do we go when we get conclusions to life. For example, take the Big Bang as an example. Whatever conclusion you take, you could say something came from something came from nothing. Both reasonable. I could be a very good atheist. A better atheist than Stephen Law, by the way. Yes? Honestly, I do it for a living. We do these courses all the time. But why does someone take that route and not the other route? Now let me say, because it's more reasonable. But so is the other route. Because it's the state of being. It's your state of heart. That's why even in the realities in the scientific world, eugenics came about. That's a rational, reasonable conclusion in some scientific circles. Just recently, in a journal of science, they came up with a theory and a conclusion based upon results that the most intelligent people and the only intelligent people that are far more superior than anyone else is a particular tribe of the Jewish people. Why do you form those conclusions? You may say because it's the reality, it's fact. No. There's an inclination as well that guides you there. This is why the Quran, it tells us to ask for purification of the soul and the heart of the self before we even take knowledge. Because if you don't purify this, you could come up to any conclusions. Look at Hitler. How he tried to justify his philosophical realities, yeah? So the point I'm trying to make is this. How does the Quran tell us to deal with arrogance? Use 2 concepts generally. Remember where you came from. You were a baby. You couldn't even wipe your own backside. You couldn't feed yourself. You couldn't even lift your own neck up. Even before that, you were despised fluid. And now you think you could challenge everything? Also, remember where you're going. كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةَ الْمَوْتِ. Every soul is going to taste death, the Quran says. We're going to become worm buffet. That's not to fear you. It's just to show you that our egos don't mean anything. They're ephemeral. They're empty in nature. And I believe if a human being purifies themselves that way, not from a just spiritual perspective, but just as a human being kills the self, because the self is like a veil that stops us from acknowledging stuff, then we won't come to bizarre conclusions. And that's the reality, because we could sit here to and fro, what the Quran really means, is it really ambiguous, is there scope of interpretation, going to the classical exegesis. We could do this academically, but at the end of the day, it's where your heart inclines in the first place. And that is the reality. This is why we believe that human beings are in a state of fitra, which means a natural disposition. And we believe that disposition is good. And we see world from those eyes. So I just wanted to address that. It wasn't a question. Can I get a question?
I feel like I ought to respond. It's an interesting fact that people do disagree, not so much on, whether the Earth goes around the sun and so on, although they used to disagree about that, but on certain kinds of question. There are things that, when it comes to aliens, the supernatural, crystal healing, whether the entire universe is just 6,000 years old and so on, whether there's a God, you find that there is an enormous range of differing opinions. And it's tempting for some people to conclude that because there is this enormous range of opinion, that therefore the question is open. It's impossible to decide. And that is not true. The fact that 100 million Americans believe the entire universe is 6,000 years old, and they believe that that is consistent with the scientific evidence. And many of these people are college-educated people, very intelligent, many more intelligent than anyone in this room. And we know for sure that they're wrong. And in fact, we also, to some extent, understand why, nevertheless, they believe what they do. And it's because of the extraordinary ability of religion to get smart people to believe stupid things. And we all know that that's true because we know that they're stupid. Well, not that they're stupid, they're smart people, but what they believe is demonstrably rubbish. And the same is true, frankly, I'm sorry to tell you this, of all that 9/11 conspiracy stuff. It's just a lot of conspiratorial crap, frankly. It's not true. Now, the fact that people disagree about that doesn't mean that it cannot be demonstrated to be crap. It can. But here's what really worries me about the way the conversation's now going, is that what's happening now is that, I'm being accused of arrogance, yet I'm the one that says I don't know the answer to the question, and Hamzة is the one who insists that he does know the answer to the question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is my character being attacked now? This is called ad hominem. Right? I'm being attacked personally. It's being suggested that there's something wrong with me because I am being arrogant and I'm failing to open up my mind and so on. That's because I'm winning the argument. And Hamzة knows it.
Attack you, I'm sorry. I didn't
you
see
did. You suggested.
I was very conceptual.
You implied I was being arrogant.
No, I'm arrogant too. That's what we mean. I said all human beings.
Well then, what you're doing is you're playing what you're doing. What I call in my book, which is published soon, which you can still buy. And the book. Here's what the book is called: Believing Bullshit. Right? Comes out in April, and one of the chapters is called Going Nuclear. And going nuclear is the strategy of when you realise that you're losing the argument, you destroy everything, rationally speaking, by saying, but of course we can't know anything really, can we? We must acknowledge our limitations, and we should... Suddenly rationality goes out the window the minute it looks like the argument is being lost. And now let's show a little humility here, shall we? That's the card that we're going nuclear now, because things are not going Hamza's way, and he knows it.
In response to that, I think that's an attack on me.
Yeah.
So, first and foremost, I want to connect with you as a human being, right? And the way to do that...
Oh, I do. Look, yeah. It's not... I like you, actually.
That's good. But I love you. This is what we have to understand. Look, let's be fair, right?
Yeah.
I think we should have this conversation.
We should be fair, yeah.
It's not just religious people...
You started with the arrogant.
No, because, see, you have to understand from an Islamic perspective, because we believe human beings are intrinsically arrogant. It's not a nuclear thing, it's a state of humanity. That's what we're talking about. And I want to say that we do have reasons to believe, which I gave reasons to believe. You didn't break down none of my arguments. You didn't bring undercutting defeaters. But the point I'm trying to make is this. The issue I'm saying is religious people can come up with silly things. But it could also be people who are not religious come up with silly things too. Yeah. So it's unfair just to tar the brush to religious, you're all crazy guys. Because that's, again, a European Christian narrative. Because in the Middle Ages, medieval time, if you looked around the corner to the Muslim world, we had science. Do you see? So who's to blame? We can't take a specific European history and apply it to the Muslim world. Yeah. So, and the other thing I'm trying to say is, Richard Dawkins recently, for example, he's an atheist, he said that the start of evolution was done by aliens. He said this. He said this directly. Some aliens planted mitochondria on a meteorite and sent it to Earth. He said that. So the point is, he may sound bizarre and stupid too. And so can religious people, but to just focus on the religious people, that's unfair, and that is offensive. This is why we need to be fair as human beings. Yes, religious people come up with funny things. Human beings come up with funny things. And that is a reality. And that's why I think we should address that. So, because what we do, we don't want to split the audience, atheists versus Muslims. We want to address them as human beings, give them concepts they could apply as tools to deal with reality. And the way to do that is to make a fair balance and say, you know what, religious people can be crazy, but you know what, so can non-religious people.
Well, that's true too, and I don't want to deny that. But let me just say, look, I was responding to the point that because there's a lot of disagreement about something, therefore it can't be rationally settled, and that doesn't follow. And that was the point.
I agree with that. I agree.
So we are in fact, as a matter of fact, I do think that religion. I do believe that non-religious people are very capable of believing ridiculous things, but I do think that religion is particularly good in some cases at getting people to believe silly things. I'm not suggesting that all religion is silly, by no means am I suggesting that, but there are clearly very many examples of religious people who believe really bizarre things, and it seems to be something about the nature of religion that makes that particularly easy for them. And I don't know whether you agree with that or not.
Well, maybe somebody else.
I think we unfortunately we do have to end it there. Because we have to be. I know. If it was up to me, then obviously I'd allow it to continue. But unfortunately, I'm just sharing. Look how many one more questions are actually left. So, what we can do is obviously, unfortunately, my sister's going to have a right go at me if I don't get our thing. So by all means, I'm sure the speakers won't mind. You can always speak to them outside of the building, and they will end there. Thank you.